Africa's new era of safer gambling.
Right, welcome everyone. Perhaps I'll do a very brief introduction. I think anyone who was here on the last panel, I'm Garron Whitesman from Whitesmans Attorneys. To my immediate left is Robin Bennett, who's Head of Department for Compliance at the Western Cape Gambling Board and who I've had a great privilege to work with for many, many years. To his immediate left is Yvonne Skepu, who is the Head of Legal, correct, for the Mpumalanga Economic Regulator, also known as, well, we know sort of colloquially as the Mpumalanga Gambling Board. And Yvonne used to be at the Western Cape Board, and we've also worked together for many years, happily so. And then I have Mathabo Sekhonyana, who is the CMO, Chief Marketing Officer from Bettabets, who I've known for many years, but we've never actually had the privilege of meeting. So I think the topic of responsible gambling and what's happening in the responsible gambling world is certainly one that's really hot on everyone's lips at the moment, and not just in South Africa and not just in Africa. It probably is the single biggest issue in many senses that people are talking about at the moment. And when we talk about responsible gambling, I think everyone who was here on the last panel, there was some, and I'll be 1 minute, discussion about, the KYC and implementation of KYC. In many senses, there's a question about, is that an AML function or is that a responsible gambling function? And of course, some jurisdictions have taken it as far as to say, well, not only is it an AML function, but it's a responsible gambling function. And when you do CDD, when you're required to do EDD, when you're required to be looking at bank statements and determining affordability. We're not quite there yet. So the question is, and that I have, and sorry, we actually had a bit of a discussion about this initially, so I actually need to look at these, is what we've seen in South Africa, and I'll certainly start with South Africa, is a 27% growth, according to the National Gambling Board's last report, in the industry, in total volumes being bet. I mean, it was the last reported year was in excess of 1.1 trillion rand in stakes, which, as I've said to people, I mean, even in hard currency divided by 23.50 to the pound, it's a tremendous amount of money. Have we seen, with the increase and growth in the market, an increase in problem gambling? And I'm going to put this to Robin. And what I mean from that perspective is, obviously one would expect that if the market's grown 27%, that you're going to have more people with gambling problems, just because there are more people gambling. But have we seen a growth in the overall percentage of gambling-related issues?
Thanks, Garron. Yes, unfortunately, that is the case. There has been a tremendous increase in the level of problem gambling that we've seen. I don't have the exact percentages. It is something unfortunate, but what is concerning is we cannot be alarmed about this. While the explosion of betting may have caught us a bit off guard, specifically after COVID, that was during late 2020, and then it just basically took off. We cannot say that we're surprised by the increase in the problem gambling that we have. And that relates to a number of issues. It is something that could have maybe not have been prevented, but I do believe we could have reduced the numbers. And if we don't do anything now, we are going to have a real issue in the market at the moment. You cannot expect operators, while operators will implement measures in terms of responsible gambling, they will do things in order to obviously promote their business. But if a regulator do not put regulatory measures in place, don't expect the operators to go ahead and do the work of the regulators. As a result of that, it's the third stakeholder in the issue that suffer, and that is the punter, because the punter is not given the adequate tools to deal with this. But talking about the explosion in problem gambling in Africa, one of the biggest reasons that I've seen is first of all is you do have quite a number of new operators on board, but it's the introduction of the new games and the type of new games. Crash games, that has been a cause of a number of the gambling issues. And that is something in hindsight, one looks at it and say, how could we have prevented that? Is I think when we introduce new games into the market, that is where you got to get player education. Advise the player. This is not your normal sports betting type of game where you're placing a bet. It gives the crash game gives people a sense of belief that they're in control of it. And as a result of that, not understanding it properly, that does give rise to that. And we're not only seeing a rise in problem gambling only in South Africa. Still talking to other regulators across Africa, we've seen the same issues. And they also have a bit of an issue in terms of the crash games. So there's a number of lessons that we can be learned from this, and we can rectify it. But like I said, we cannot rectify this through just mere discussions. There are things that we have to put in place. And we almost reached a critical point. If we do not do something about it very soon, we are going to have a bigger issue that we will not be able to deal with.
Thanks, Robin. Yvonne, that leads quite nicely on to the next question, really, is Robin saying, there's a problem with certain games have proved particularly addictive, I suppose would be the correct, or particularly dangerous or potentially dangerous. What, in your view as a regulator, from probably the other province in South Africa that has, is the biggest regulator, particularly in the online space, what to you makes a decent responsible gambling sort of program or set of rules? What should we be looking for? What are you thinking about at this moment as a regulator?
Thank you, Garron. I think that responsible gambling is essentially concerned with making the gambling environment safer for patrons that consume gambling, but also for broader society and the community. And I think the first step, as Bennett indicated, is probably to look at having a regulatory regime that at least sets the parameters within which the industry can roll out their responsible gambling programs. I think we don't want a situation where it is optional for operators to have certain standards and tools available for patrons to use during their gameplay and participating in gambling. I think another cardinal point is to actually have a workable treatment and counseling program, preferably, as is the case in South Africa, you have a national treatment program. And the question becomes, should that be optional? I think the unique experience of South Africa is that the industry actually started the South African Responsible Gambling Program, and they funded it on a voluntary basis. But I do think that our African counterparts can certainly look at putting that as a mandatory requirement so that at least there is some form of a buffer, and you know that the expertise is there to deal with treatment and counseling. Linked to that, Garron, is the question of an exclusion program. And I think that with the rise in technology and the different iGaming offerings, you actually have tools that can assist punters that participate in gaming. Tools such as exclusions, placing limits on your time that you gamble, placing limits on the amounts that you intend spending. And the last important point that I want to raise is the question of advocacy, research, and prevalence studies. You know, your first question, Garron, centered on where are we in terms of problem gambling. Even the first panel's discussion centered around what are we dealing with, what are the major issues facing the industry, facing the regulators, and the social issues in society. And that is where your research and your advocacy comes in. Having structured institutions that is actually funded to conduct those prevalence studies to find out which particular gambling modes increase harm to patrons, etc. And I do think that a patron, him or herself, also bears personal responsibility in terms of accessing the tools, in terms of educating yourself, and actually staying in tune with reality to realize I need assistance and where do I go to for that. That is just some thoughts in terms of the important regulatory aspects that as a regulator you would have to focus on getting it right and then obviously monitoring and changing the rules as you go along.
Thanks, Yvonne. Mathabo, I mean, you're the CMO for Better Gaming. Better Gaming has been around for years, or Bettabets, in South Africa. Have you noticed through your players an increase in self-exclusions, problem gambling? Has it changed your view of the world as the CMO as to sort of what marketing materials you're putting out there, how you think you should, as a business, be looking at attracting players through marketing, or are you going, you know what, the reality is others are marketing this way, we want the players, we got it too. I mean, what kind of pressure does that put on you as an operator?
Thank you very much. I think that there's a misconception that operators, because we obviously are in the game of making money, that we don't care about responsible gambling, where it's just a tick box exercise, right? But if you're looking at the regulations that, for example, the Premier League is going to be bringing in overseas, where you're not allowed to market on shirts anymore. When operators focus on competition instead of collaboration when it comes to responsible gambling, that's where you get over-regulation. But where as operators you come together for a responsible market, that's where you get consistent, moderate play, where you are still making money. From a Bettabets perspective, I think to your question about what we're seeing is what we're beginning to realize as, there's even this greater boom in gambling, is that the issues are societal issues. We've done a lot of research around why our customers are gambling, which ones we see as problem gamblers, that kind of thing. And it's actually financial literacy issues, right? It's budgeting issues. It's those kinds of interventions as operators that we need to be focusing on. When we are using our CSI budgets, we need to be taking a strategic approach to CSI. When we are putting on, for me, for example, your marketing hat, it's not just about self-exclusion, but it's about targeting a responsible gambler, targeting someone who's in it for a wager, who's there to entertain themselves, and kind of being, I suppose, very taking it down to the detail of the words you use, the colors you use, what targeting you put behind your lead generation. And I think as operators, if we are all kind of operating in that mindset of collaboration when it comes to responsible gambling, we're all going to make probably even more money in a safer way for our customers.
Look, I think that's right. And I think that's, you want people playing consistently and having, like any business, longevity of your customers and as little attrition as possible, particularly where there is so much competition and really good competition. And let me ask the regulators, okay, back to the regulators. What's coming? What's coming from a regulatory perspective? When people have been asking me recently what changes do I see coming in the market, one of the things I say is, look, I think the regulators are concerned about responsible gambling. I would be interested to hear what your views are about your fellow regulators in Africa. I may ask some of the difficult questions, okay? But I say I do foresee that sooner rather than later, we're going to see an increased responsible gambling program. And if it's not from provincial boards, possibly at a national level in some way, but I think it's going to be driven by the provinces, as most things are. I mean, what's coming down the line? A lot of people are interested in this market and Africa. What What do you say is coming as a regulator?
Okay, Garron, with respect to the legislation, is the board had recently approved amendments to its general rules, where we've inserted a number of responsible gambling measures, which is going to be all license holders going to be obligated to adhere to that. It specifically centers around license holder having to adopt a responsible gambling internal control procedures. It is going to be standard across all license holders in the Western Cape. That to us will be the minimum standards. If we look beyond South Africa and we look at what's happening in other African jurisdictions, we do believe that they are, while the challenges that they got may seem unique to them, it's not different from what we have in. So we're having a bit of discussion with other regulators of looking at something, let's call it not a uniform standard approach, but at least minimum standards regarding responsible gambling. There's one thing that we could never actually get rid of, let's say, in terms of regulatory arbitrage. So you're always going to get people going to certain jurisdictions because the tax favors them or that favors them. But I think when it comes to responsible gambling, that is one area that we must try to eliminate completely so that all license holders operate on the same footing when it comes to responsible gambling. Yes, we do understand everybody's competitive, they want to make money, but at the end of the day, it is the punter that suffers. So I do understand there are operators that introduce responsible gambling measures, and we applaud them. Unfortunately, that is not enough because an operator will only put in so far and it doesn't actually affect the business. And then at the same time, the market has become extremely competitive. So why would one operator spend X amount of money to implement regulatory measures, which is not a requirement? So that is the reason why we have to do the responsible gambling measures as we're going to introduce in terms of our general rules. What I also do believe is those license holders who go over and above what is required by the legislation is they should also get some type of recognition in terms of the programs that they're introducing. Because at this point in time, if we are not going to enforce these measures, like I said, we are going to have an issue with the market. So that is the thing that we're doing at the moment. And we are, like I said, is in discussion with other jurisdictions across Africa to consider what we'll call a minimum standards in respect of responsible gambling.
Thanks, Robin. Yvonne, I mean, as a co-regulator, do you think we should be going as far as really like what we're seeing in the UK, we're seeing in Sweden, we're seeing from the KSA out of the Netherlands, where in many senses there's a tremendous amount of obligation being placed on operators to assess affordability? Is that part of what one should be contemplating as from a responsible gambling perspective, or is that just actually overkill?
Yeah, I think we need to look at the particular technological position of Africa in terms of saying how do we get to that stage. Garron, I think that we're not ready to venture into looking at affordability. I think at a minimum, the focus should be on tracking player behavior and having actual tools embedded in the gaming systems to assist problem gamblers and to flag those that may require assistance or have impaired gambling or decision-making capability pertaining their gambling behaviors. And also in terms of the focus, your question before this, I think that for the Mpumalanga Economic Regulator, it is important that operators actually have a proposal around a responsible gambling program. I think often as regulators, we award licenses and then a few years down the line, we want to look at license conditions and we want to look at what are you going to do in terms of responsible gambling. It is actually important to deal with that at the pre-licensing phase so that when you award that license and that right to operate, that the operator is committed and locked into ensuring responsible gambling practices and that they apply those policies in their day-to-day operations.
Thanks, Yvonne. I'm conscious of the time that we've got 20 seconds left. Just want to get any final thoughts from Mathabo. I mean, having heard all these things, operator perspective, regulator perspective, is there anything that you go, that sounds like it would be a bit hectic for us, or, talking to our colleagues in the industry, that goes a little bit far, undoable? I mean, where would you be at in that?
I think the first thing, to Yvonne's point, is understanding where the market is from a tech and an AI perspective, because that's really how, from an operator perspective, you're going to be able to implement real responsible gambling that goes further than self-exclusion. But what I would ask our regulator friends is to look at really unlicensed operators as well, because those are the people who are not just killing businesses for licensed operators that are not just doing what we need to do, but even more than we need to do, but are really what is the issue or the cancer in the society in that sense, because they are going after vulnerable players in a way that is completely unregulated, and in a way that is taking enough from our pockets that we also can't use it in the spaces like responsible gambling.
Absolutely. We're 1 minute down. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure and privilege as always. And I think we move on to the next panel.